Hi there, class. In order to avoid war, the European nations uh, used a philosophy of balance of power. And balance of power was the idea of keeping any one nation from becoming so strong that it thought it could take over all of Europe. And so they did that by forming alliances with one another. And so nobody would be able to dominate the other. And so when they felt it was necessary, they went to war to maintain this balance and causing shifts in diplomatic alliances. But what happened is, despite the many changes in alliances, as we'll notice, Prussia always seemed to be aligned against Austria, and England was always aligned against France. And so this system of alliances is demonstrated by the three major wars of the period that happened. The first one is called the War of Spanish Succession. And that started when the Habsburg king died in 1700, the Habsburg king of Spain. In his will, he gave the throne to his young grandnephew, Philip, who was also the grandson of Louis XIV of France. So Louis, seeing an opportunity to make some gains, he claimed the Spanish throne for Philip. And other nations feared what would happen if France and Spain got together. And so they formed a grand alliance, it was called, to block Louis' actions. And the armies won many victories on the European continent, and they almost wiped out the French force in 1704. And in 1705, England captured Gibraltar, which was a post on the southern tip of Spain. And also it carried over into North America too. That was fought on the North American continent, what was called Queen Anne's War over here. And the war finally ended in 1713 with the signing of a series of agreements. Like the typical wars did, they really got tired of fighting and they just decided to end it and come up with these agreements called the Treaty of Utrecht. Pretty important. Philip was allowed to retain the throne of Spain as long as he didn't unite with France. Spain had to surrender her possessions in the Netherlands and in the Mediterranean area to Austria, and Britain won various Canadian territories from France: Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Hudson Bay Territory, and they also got to keep the strategic port of Gibraltar. And Gibraltar was a very important port, as we talked about before, because it was the only entrance into the Mediterranean Sea. The second war was the War of Austrian Succession. And so this was a conflict that spread over three continents. In 1713, the Emperor of Austria, Charles VI, drew up a document called the Pragmatic Sanction because he was trying to prevent Austria's neighbors from taking advantage of his daughter Maria Theresa when she took over the throne of Austria when he passed away. So the rulers signed it, agreeing to respect the territorial borders of Austria. Well, one ruler had no intention of abiding by that, and that was Frederick II of Prussia. He wanted that rich mining area in a place called Silesia, which belonged to Austria. So, August 1740, just after Maria Theresa had taken over, Frederick invaded the province. And by the following year, Prussia had a stronghold in Silesia and signed a peace treaty with Austria. But then France entered the war against Austria, hoping to gain territory at Austria's expense, again taking advantage of Maria Theresa. Spain entered the war to retrieve Italian lands they'd lost to Austria. So now, Britain, afraid of what would happen to George II's lands in Hanover, part of Prussia, or the German territories, entered the war on the side of Austria. So now here's another war. But it wasn't confined to the European continent. It spread to North America, again, where the British defeated the French. And this was called King William's War. And we're the war, finally, they got tired of fighting again. It spread over into India, and the nations of Europe ended the treaty and ended the war, signed the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. And it merely ended the fighting. Didn't really change anything much. Frederick was allowed to keep Silesia, but it restored everything to what's called status quo ante bellum, the way things were before the war. Then, in 1754, fighting broke out between France and Britain in the New World. It's called the 7 Years' War, which is known in the United States as the French and Indian War. And so at the same time, Frederick II decided to take more of Austria's territory, but Frederick miscalculated. France reversed her foreign policy. And so France put aside their antagonism against Austria, and they decided to stop Prussian advancement. So this radical change in alliances, called the Diplomatic Revolution, set the stage for the 7 Years' War. And so soon after the fighting broke out, a man named William Pitt, who was a statesman in England, came up with a system for winning the war. And he decided to supply Prussia with financial aid and used his nation to keep French troops occupied in Europe. Meanwhile, Britain would attempt to destroy the French sea power and make it easier to defeat the French in North America and India. They had a tremendous success with her part of the plan. And in North America, she had more than 40,000 troops. So by the end of the war, they'd seized many French ports, captured the key French city of Quebec. And on the continent of Europe, however, Prussia ran into difficulties. Hostilities began when Frederick II invaded the Kingdom of Saxony. He found himself surrounded by enemies, and Frederick's superior army kept his enemies at bay, but he was greatly outnumbered. And so he won the battles. He finally just was able to withdraw his troops and sign an agreement with Frederick. So Russia withdrew, Britain kind of eased up, and they signed a treaty. The Treaty of Hubertsburg brought the war to a close on the continent of Europe and allowed Frederick to maintain his hold on Silesia. So he still got a hold of Silesia that he gained back in the previous war, King William's War. Later in 1763, France, Britain, and Spain signed the Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, as it's otherwise known. And it had a number of very important consequences. First, France lost all territory in the mainland of North America, lost everything. Britain got all of Canada and the French territory east of the Mississippi. France lost most of her commercial holdings in India. The Battle of Plassey paved the way for the British India Company to take over all of India, and Spain lost Florida to Great Britain, but received New Orleans and Louisiana from France in return. So as a result of the war, England became not only the leading European power, but also a major world power. But the balance of power wasn't always maintained by war. Sometimes diplomacy worked, and one involved Poland. It's a large independent nation, but it didn't have any natural boundaries. Surrounded on three sides by major powers, and was unable to defend themselves. They were weak and inefficient. Prussia, Russia, and Austria all were trying to figure out how they could gain parts of Poland. So through secret negotiation, they made a deal to partition Poland among themselves. And in the years 1772 to 95, they seized Polish territory until finally Poland disappeared from the map of Europe. And it was not until 150 years later, 120 years later, after World War I, did Poland again exist as an independent nation. So that gets us through the end of the chapter and looking at the balance of power. So thanks for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.